Okay. Well, welcome everyone from around the globe. So looking forward to hearing from our amazing presenters today, but just very quickly, as I said, recording this presentation so that we can share it more broadly and also on our YouTube page that I'll put a link to in the chat and in the follow-up email. My name is Jen Kuba, and I serve as the Assistant Director for the ABCD Institute, housed at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. And I will be the one sending that follow-up email with information on how to connect with us further following today's story share, and looking forward to sharing more opportunities to connect in the months to come through the Institute and our new online network. But I want to keep things moving here and keep us on track, so I'll pass it over to Helen to share a little bit more about the Story Share series.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen, and welcome to your new role. I know it's been a little while, but it's always a while for being new. And we appreciate so much what you do to hold together an institute that is, as we see, truly global, which is very exciting. I am based at the Stain Center for Community-Based Service Learning, sometimes right around the corner from where Jen is situated right now at the Stain Center for Community-Based Service Learning at DePaul University in Chicago. And I was part of the higher education interest group of the ABCD network that came up with the idea of having a story series where people would share how they were using ABCD in their practice. At the time, about 4 years ago, we knew that people were using this not just in the traditional neighborhood organizing way that maybe was being written about the most, but in lots of different arenas. And so we began to ask folks, could you share a story with us? And it has waxed and waned a bit, but we're very excited that we are bringing that back with the new network, and that Rich and Michelle have kindly agreed to share both what the ABCD network or framework can, how it relates to trauma-informed work and how trauma-informed work relates to ABCD. So both of those things happening at the same time. And each topic is different, and that provides the richness of this series. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rich, and he'll take it away with this wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Helen. So good evening. My name is Rich. I'm calling in from Gloucester in the UK, and my co-presenter today is Michelle. Michelle, it's very early for you, isn't it? Feel free to answer, Michelle.
Sorry, Rich. I was having trouble unmuting myself. That's probably as a consequence of it being 5:30 in the morning here.
5:30.
So
That
yeah,
is dedication to the cause.
that's
But
it, bright and early.
so we'll be sharing some learning. And I guess this conversation about trauma-informed practice through an ABCD lens for the two of us has been emerging over the last year, 18 months or so. So we're certainly not experts in this space, but we have been thinking about the topic for a long time. You may have questions that emerge during the presentation today, so do feel free to put them in the chat, and Helen and Jen will be monitoring those and feeding back at the end. So yeah, without further ado, we will move on. He says that. There we go. So to start with, we normally have an acknowledgement of country, and Michelle, I'm going to turn to you for this. So if you wouldn't mind starting for us.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Richard. So I'm coming to you from the lands of the Larrakia people here in Darwin in the Northern Territory. And I encourage you in the chat to put the lands that you're coming from. If you know the First Nations or the tribal or clan groups, please pop it in the chat. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands, the Larrakia people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the collective wisdom that our elders have shared for millennia, and particularly when it comes to um, trauma and trauma-informed practice. We know that story sharing is truly important, and I think First Peoples around the globe have done this for forever. It's the part of the way we operate. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which each of you are dialing in from today. And I can see there are some of my Aussie mates from down in Palawa country, down in Tasmania, or Lutruwita. So thank you for joining us. And I can see a few of you popping in where you're from. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that this land here in Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. In Australia, we do not have treaty. We are the only colonised country that does not have treaty with our First Nations people. So with that said, I'm going to hand back to you, Rich, to continue on whilst I'm enjoying watching where everybody's traditional owners are. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And I always find this bit a little bit awkward coming from the UK because of our history and our reputation for colonisation. So I'd like to also read out an acknowledgement as well. So we acknowledge that the land on which we live and work has a deep history of human connection, belonging and stewardship. We honour the Indigenous First Nations and local communities who have shaped and cared for these landscapes across generations. We recognise the ongoing impact of colonisation and systemic injustices that have marginalised communities, and we commit to listening, learning and working towards equity and justice. In the spirit of respect, we celebrate the strengths of communities past and present, and we commit to fostering relationships that honour shared histories and build a future rooted in dignity, inclusion and care for the land and its people. So as we've said, I'm Richard. I'm co-founder of Go Together. I'm based here in the UK, and specifically I work on co-created community solutions. I've been involved in the ABCD network for about, I guess, probably about 10 years, possibly longer. I can't remember when I first met you, Michelle, but it's been quite a long time now. And as Michelle said, she's based in Darwin City in Northern Territory and working as a program manager for minimal land management, but also works for the Yeader Institute as well, who do a lot of international work on community and community building and community engagement. So I just want to set a little bit of context. I'm going to set this in the context of the UK to start with, just talking a little bit more generally about stress and anxiety. And I don't know about you, but we've certainly noticed that there has been an increase of stress in the UK and probably in the Western world over the last 5 years, possibly longer. So I just want to share some of these reports here. So this is the burnout report from 2024, where 91% of respondents experienced high or extreme levels of pressure or stress in the last year. That's pretty high. And then when you start looking at some of the other reports, they're saying similar things. So UNICEF, the children's organisation, 49% of parents reported feeling overwhelmed. 43 were anxious. 36 unsupported, 26% lonely. That's a lot of the adult population, and certainly parents, who are feeling things aren't working for them at the moment. And certainly with children and young people, we're seeing a similar pattern. So more than 500 children a day in England are being referred to mental health services for anxiety. And when we look at that in terms of school attendance, we're also seeing that on the increase. And it's nearly doubled, rising from 4.7 to 7.5 compared to pre-pandemic. So something's happening to all of us. I just want to kind of set some context around that. Um, the problem is that the responsibility for getting better, if we're living with stress or anxiety, the responsibility for getting better often lies with you as an individual. So if you're not feeling great and you go to the doctor will say, well, here's some medication. Or I think, have you considered your lifestyle? Have you considered doing more exercise or eating healthier? The thing is that puts the pressure on us as individuals to get better. But what if it's the socio-economic, environmental, or even political conditions which are the cause of that overwhelm? So I just want you to imagine you've got your cup, your glass of everyday pressures that are happening in your life. That could be family stuff that's going on, racing around to get the kids to school on time. Perhaps you're looking after elderly relatives. Your cup, yeah, okay, it's busy, and it's stressful, but you're coping, you're managing. If you imagine you've got a jug that's full of the complexities of society, of the socio-economic stuff that's going on, and you start pouring in, so things like a global pandemic, perhaps there's an environmental disaster in your community, and Michelle may talk about bushfires later on, or a cost of living crisis, which is certainly happening here in the UK, or even a global pandemic. It's not long before your glass of everyday stuff is full to the brim and overflowing. And that can be a real challenge. And I've called it here, I don't know if any of you have come across the term of VUCA, or increasingly what's being called now BANI. But VUCA, it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that certainly has described where we've been. Where are we going? Well, perhaps things are now BANI, brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. And I think if we think about and reflect on some of our lives and the things that are going on within our own communities or in the wider global context at the moment, perhaps that does start to articulate perhaps why things may feel tough for some people. So if we look at the broad agenda here and go, well, there's a lot of individuals that perhaps are struggling with stress or overwhelm or individual trauma. Perhaps actually it's collective trauma that we're experiencing. If there's many people, and those statistics there are suggesting there's more individuals experiencing the same thing, perhaps it's collective trauma. So that collective trauma refers to the impact of traumatic experiences that affects entire groups of people, or even communities or societies. And it can bring distress and negative consequences to individuals, but it can also change the fabric of that community. And that can be a really tough thing for any community or group of people to understand and to get to grips with. So I just want to reflect a little bit for a moment on the impact that collective trauma can have on us as individuals. And I think it can be really difficult because it's very subtle, because you think it's about you, but actually it's happening to a whole load of other people within our networks simultaneously and at the same time. And there's that reduced sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. We lose track of who we are and what we're here to do. It can increase our anxiety and increase depression. And we're probably seeing that through prescription of antidepressant drugs. And it also reduces our sense of trust. How close are we to the people that we live near? And is that decreasing? And could that be as a result of collective trauma? We also see increases in antisocial behaviour and that reduction in social connectedness. And as a result of those, we also see those increases in addictive behaviour. So I guess, it'd be interesting to hear from you in the chat just about the things that you're noticing in your communities as you progress through community life. So I just, for a moment, this is from my colleague Kate, who I worked with at KCA, and I think it really helps to clarify things. I'm going to talk a little bit about fear and flow and transformation. So when we're stressed and we're overwhelmed, we're often in a fear state. And when we're in that fear state, as human beings, we're born to disconnect and survive. We cut ourselves off and we step back from the world. But when we're in a flow state and we're in a good place, We're born to connect and care for each other. So the challenge, though, is that how do you flip from a fear state to a flow state? And I guess the thing that we need to keep holding on to is that humans are born to reconnect and recover. We're tribal creatures. That's how we've survived for so many years. And when we're in that space of fear, what we actually need is each other. And when we can reconnect with each other, we can move into a place of what we called here self-healing communities and transformation. Perhaps it's in that place that we don't necessarily need clinicians, but we do need each other. That's not to say that there are points in our lives where perhaps medical intervention is required, but there are other things that we can do that can support each other and help us through that recovery process. So if we are experiencing a collective mental health crisis, it's going to have an impact on the next generation. If adults are struggling emotionally, our ability to support our children and the young people within our communities is going to be affected by that. And I love this quote by Bessel van der Kolk. The parent-child connection is the most powerful mental health intervention known to mankind. What tends to happen, certainly within children's services, is we focus our efforts on the children. We offer them the support and the therapy and the clinical intervention. But what if that is true around the parent-child connection, why aren't we redirecting those efforts towards the adults in that child life? And those adults also need that strong network of support around them. So our communities have to have that central role in creating a culture of mutual aid and emotional support. So communities are at the heart of our recovery if we're experiencing that collective trauma. And there was a really fantastic researcher who started to notice some of this. But this guy is Robert Ander, and that name may sound familiar to some of you, because Robert was one of the principal researchers on the ACEs program, the Adverse Childhood Experiences research project. And he started to look at the role that communities play in healing. And he noticed that many people do not seek healing or recovery through formal services. We prefer to turn to one another and or cultural specific home and community practices. And I know if I reflect on my time, if I've wobbled or not felt great, I'm probably more likely to turn to friends in the first instance before turning to a professional or a clinician. And there are lots of communities across the world that do that very naturally and organically. And I think Michelle will talk about that in just a moment. So, Michelle, I'm just going to invite you now because I think you've done a lot of work with communities across Australia and been involved in some of these in some of the recovery processes as well. So it'd be grateful if you could just share a little bit of your experience and stories, perhaps from the bush.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And I thought I love this quote from Tish King, who is a woman from the Torres Strait Island here, and also a proud warrior woman for the environment. So I just thought such a beautiful quote that when we think when country is hurting, we're hurting because we're so deeply connected to the land. And to our islands. So we think about, particularly for Indigenous and First Nations people, there's not a differentiation between ourselves and the land that we stand on. We are one. We are the country and the country is us. So as Rich said, I've spent many years working in bushfire, particularly recovery and a bit of flood recovery here in Australia. And when Rich talks about collective trauma, we see that impacting communities across the world as a result of climate change and climate change disasters, whether it be floods, cyclones, tornadoes, or bushfires. We're seeing more and more of these natural disasters occurring, which has a lasting impact. And unfortunately, many of the communities that are impacted by these disasters are small rural communities that have very few services or very few agencies to support. So that sense of community healing is even more profound, and sense of reaching out to our neighbours, our friends, our families, um, for that support. And I think that there's been such a disconnect in the work that we do around building community capacity, um, to respond to sort of these big major events that happen in our lives, by not recognizing where trauma fits into that. And it's not, when it's happening to your whole community, it's not your own trauma. It's that collective trauma that will be experienced differently, because even within a community experiencing a natural disaster, everybody's experience are different. Everybody's reactions are their own. There's not one sense of what trauma looks like. So I think that, when we can actually acknowledge that if we're working with communities that have been impacted by community scale trauma, that we actually understand what that looks like, and how that impacts the families and the community members. And what you tend to find, and what I've found in my experience, is one of the big things that comes to the fore is mistrust of authorities, mistrust of governments, and quite often mistrust with those people that you always would reach out to for support, your friends, your family, your neighbours. And a lot of that is caused by the systems that are in place. If we only look at community disasters from a let's put out the fire or let's clean up after the floods, and we actually forget to look after the people and create space for communities to come together, to yarn about what's going on, and to heal together, I think we really miss um, that vital cog, which can have lasting impacts. So if my story was, and I've been in multiple disasters, you'd probably never want to come on a holiday with me, because during holidays I've been in earthquakes, I've been in cyclones, I've been in bushfires, and I've been in floods.
And you've
But
been in
my
a pandemic, Michelle, as well, because you were
oh,
over here when the pandemic kicked off.
absolutely. And of course, Australia had some of the most stringent pandemic lockdown um, laws, rules, which in the initial stages was like, oh, this is great. We get to take a breath. But, after about 18 months, it started to get a bit much, and everybody was craving for that connection. But my small community that I used to live in Victoria, a community of about 4,500 people, stretching across an area of probably about 200 square kilometres, was impacted by the 2009 bushfires, which at that time was Australia's worst bushfire disaster. And I spent many years working in my own community on recovery. And that sort of started to lead me down that journey of asking the question of where was trauma informed responses in either community development, in community building, but particularly in recovery. And it wasn't there at all. So it sort of led me down a bit of a path since then. And now I'm actually doing my master's in um, particularly trauma-informed responses to disasters in remote Aboriginal communities here in Australia. So yeah, it's interesting, and I can just see Bex put a comment in there about, there were no debriefings or support for workers or even the community back in the 2009 fires, and 16 years ago now, and there's still not a lot developed in that space. So, yeah, I think that it's crucial that we recognise that even if we're working in a community and we don't know where that community's been, we don't know that community's story, that we actually work from a space of an assumption that everybody in that community has been through trauma, and there's a sense of collective trauma for the whole group. And I suppose particularly in post the pandemic is that, we've all experienced that major event globally, that we have that shared experience, and people have come through that with varying levels of trauma. So I think it's, making sure that we work from a trauma-informed approach is really important. And I'm going to ask you to click over to the next slide, Rich.
Slowly but surely. There we go. So, Michelle, I put this slide in at the last minute. Really, but I think there's some useful things in here that we can learn from what I've called here wiser cultures. And some of these observations come from a chap called Bruce Perry. He wrote a book called What Happened to You? And he wrote that with Oprah Winfrey. I'm going to hold it up at the screen. So if you want to have a look at that and purchase that from your local bookstore, not anyone else, then please do so. But Michelle, what Bruce is talking about here is some of the things that we can learn from Aboriginal healing practices. And I don't know, from your experience of working with tribal communities and with Aboriginal communities, do these things resonate for you in terms of how those communities respond to collective trauma?
Absolutely. And, for Aboriginal people here in Australia, like collective trauma and what we call intergenerational trauma has happened since we were first colonised, sort of almost 250 years ago. So trauma is nothing new to Indigenous communities. And there's so many practices, even like here in the Territory, thinking of Dadiri, which is that practice of deep listening, which actually used for self-healing, but also for community healing. And I must admit, I did say to Rich before everybody joined that I had never heard of Bruce Perry. And I just did say I'm always very conscious of white fellas that take from First Nations cultures in a really broad sense without actually giving true reference to that. So, this has come from Indigenous cultural intellectual property somewhere, and Bruce has gone, beautiful, I'm going to talk about it in my white man way. But I think that it comes to the difference. The difference that I see is that for Indigenous people, we're a collective culture. So it's about looking after everybody. I'm not right if my brothers and sisters aren't right. Whereas many Western cultures are very individualistic. So it's like, if I'm right, everybody else must be right, sort of thing. So I think that sense of actually leaning into traditional practices is so important, and that actually the West can learn so much more from the First Nations cultures everywhere. But you can't do that if you don't stop and listen deeply to what people are sharing with you.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to leave this over to you, really, but just tell me when you want to move on to the next slide. But this is really about trauma-informed care and the principles and practices that we might need to think about or even adopt.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So in the journey, and it's great that I've got Dee and Fiona on this call with us as well, because we started a journey a good few years ago now when I put out a call to the ABCD community and said, who's working in trauma-informed spaces and, from an ABCD lens. And the response that I got from the global ABCD community was like, actually, that's a really good question. Who is? So then we started to take a bit of a deep dive and starting with actually learning what trauma-informed care is. So these are sort of 5 key principles of trauma-informed care. So it's about creating safety for individuals and communities to come together by offering people choice, by coming at it from a really collaborative space that builds trust and respect. And Dee and Fiona will be chuckling because I really do not like the word empowerment. So empowerment comes from the literature. I tend to use the word self-determining. So, creating those spaces where we can become self-determined individuals and communities. And it all folds in on each other. It's not if you do one, you don't have to do the others. It's actually a bit of a cycle. And if one of these elements is missing, then we're not working from a trauma-informed space. So it's really about, creating that space for physical and emotional safety for individuals and community members to come together. So if you look at your work and reflect, is your work with communities led by these 5 principles or informed by these 5 principles? Because I think it's a good space for us to start about, just start to reflect on the work that we do with communities as community development practitioners, as social workers, or whatever space that you fit in, working with communities. And so that led us to discover sort of one piece of work that had come out of the US, particularly out of San Francisco, was the work that the Bridge were doing around trauma-informed community building. And the researchers on that project actually pulled together what they saw as trauma-informed community building, which is about that recognizing the impact of trauma on the community and actually creating those processes that allow for community building initiatives. So I suppose an ethos that the Jeddah Institute have worked on for many, many years is that principle of do no harm. So whenever you're working with a community, you need to understand what that community's journey has been, be aware of the trauma, and you don't want to re-traumatize people. And re-traumatizing people can come from turning up to a community with a multitude of forms that you want people to fill out, or asking people to tell their story to 15 different people just to get the same, to get the one service. So being really mindful of that. And I encourage you all to read the findings that you'll see on the screen there. That trauma-informed community building paper shares a lot of information. Also about, the second principle of that trauma-informed community building model is about acceptance, meeting community where they're at, and accepting the realities of the community. So if people don't turn up, that's not the community's fault. Maybe you haven't given enough consideration to what's that flow of that community. In my case, back in 2009, a lot of government agencies were running things at times when people were at work or school and then saying, well, where's the community? Don't care because they're not turning up. The community was actually turning up to a lot of things, but it was very much community led. So, understanding and accepting the realities of the community, and so important, go to the community. Don't expect them to come to you. Community empowerment. So that's recognizing that importance of self-determination and encouraging long-term community stewardship rather than agency stewardship or government stewardship. Understanding that power in the community exists with the community. It shouldn't be power over by various authorities. And then also creating a space for the communities to be able to reflect together, and as community workers, a space for you to be able to reflect and debrief with your colleagues is super important. And through the work that the Bridge did, they sort of came up with the 4 principles, but then thinking of some strategies, from an individual perspective, from an interpersonal community, and then much broader out to a systems approach. And I'm going to get you to go to the next slide. Thanks, Rich, because I think that for me, this was just a little bit easier to read than the previous slide. But it's around, as workers, as individuals, as organisations, as government authorities, thinking about, how do we create multiple opportunities for people to be able to interact, get together. In my community's cases, we did community dining. So, for almost 12 months, from Sunday through to Thursday, we did free community meals. I was part of a team that was cooking for up to 600 people a night. And it wasn't just about the food. It was about those opportunities for people to share. It was a no-go zone for government officials. It was just a safe space for community to be together. I'm not going to go through all of these strategies individually, and I'm just going to pick out a few for you to consider. And like I said, I encourage you, if you've not read the Bridge report, to have a look at it and actually ask yourself questions. One of the big things there in the strategies was also that never overpromise. I remember the Prime Minister of the day flying into my community, and for about 30 years, my community had been asking for a pool, a swimming pool. The Prime Minister flew in and said, your community will get your pool. Well, 15 years, well, actually 16 years later, there's still no pool in that community. And that has that's created additional trauma on top of, because the community have been advocating for that pool and absolutely getting no traction. But at the same time, the leader of the country at the time said, you'll get your pool. From a community perspective, it's about expanding those opportunities or efforts through incremental growth and building from success. Sometimes we can get stuck in the negative narrative, but we know as ABCD or asset-based community development practitioners that sitting in the mud or the negative is not where the good stuff is. When we actually see communities as this great melting pot of skills, of gifts, of people that have got a whole lot to offer, rather than being seen as victims. We need to actually allow for that sort of post-growth mindset rather than, sitting in that negative space, which actually, if you keep telling people that have been impacted by trauma how traumatized and how resilient they are, it actually adds another layer of trauma. And we also want to be cultivating community leadership at the same time, when we're working with communities. And community leadership isn't that egocentric leadership where, look at me, look how wonderful I am and what I've done for my community. It's about, wow, look at this amazing community and look what we've created together. And I also want to just touch on that space of the systems um, and how systems impact in trauma, in that from a trauma-informed community building space. And that's, I'm going to actually quote Rich because this was an amazing quote. We were talking, this was actually during the pandemic, we were talking about the importance of building relationships before you need them. And from a systems approach, that's as workers, as government authorities, it's so super important that we actually build long-term partnerships with community and invest in community change and, effective and efficient service delivery that is informed by the community, not by somebody sitting in your state or country capital deciding what that community needs. So when I think about the Bridge report and that sort of intersection with asset-based community development or community building, is I see that, when we understand the trauma impacts for community and that impact it has on the interpersonal, on structural, on historical trauma, on individuals in the community, with when we're looking at it from an ABCD lens, we acknowledge that communities have inherent wisdom and strengths, even in the face of adversity. So we're not looking to fix a community, we're looking at discovering that wisdom and those strengths and building upon that. And then when we think about the principles of safety and whether you want to call it empowerment or self-determination, ABCD identifies and mobilizes those existing community, the local knowledge and resources that support sustainable change. And lastly, obviously, at the core of asset-based community development is that emphasis on building relationships within a community so that we can leverage knowledge and resources to support community building in a much more trauma-informed way.
And I think, Michelle, the challenge and certainly the systems work is valuing the importance for people to invest in relationships, and certainly for agencies and those from an institutional background, that can be really hard to justify that time in building the relationships because there often aren't KPIs that are attached to that. Yet it's fundamental for that recovery process.
And I think there's been some great learnings there, Rich, with actually employing people that are from a community to work in their community. For too long, we've helicoptered in people from outside that actually don't understand the flow of that community, the history of that community. So when we talk about building capacity in communities, it's about actually giving people in those communities the opportunity to work within their communities, but also then making sure we support them, and that's giving them an opportunity to be able to debrief and learn from each other. Because at the end of the day, when all of the government agencies leave a community, but after a disaster, it's the community that's left to pick up the pieces. So that's where we need to build the capacity. So I think it's about, when we come at community development from a trauma-informed approach, we understand that there's a whole lot of things impacting a community, and we work with that, but we don't sit in the negative. We actually see it as opportunities to build capacity, to connect communities, and if all you're doing is just allowing people the opportunity to come together and yarn, that's actually okay. And governments need to get beyond that, just funding, and even philanthropic organisations funding 12-month projects. It doesn't work because you don't get a chance to build those relationships.
And I guess that speaks to this do no harm checklist here about the importance of going slow if you want to go far or even fast together.
Mm, mm.
So
Yeah. Sorry,
yeah,
keep going,
no,
Rich.
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, you go. I'll be quiet.
It's a time delay. That's all it is, folks. It's just a time delay. But I guess just picking up on this point here about keeping those conversations strength focused. Those communities, or all communities, have capacity and skills, and sometimes when we're if we get stuck in that deficit mindset within the context of collective trauma, it can be we can easily slip into fixing mode. And I think this is really challenging us to think really carefully and think long term about where people are at, where people are at. Is there anything else you want to say on this do no harm checklist here, Michelle?
Um, Probably just two things, and one of the is around language. So, don't come at community with academic language. Keep it simple. Understand the community. And the other thing is that be flexible, flexible, flexible. So this is actually not about you. This is about the community. And that's what if we keep that in the back of our minds when we're always working with community, um, that it's actually about them, not about us. So we need to be moving at the speed of community and allowing for lots of opportunities for people to be involved and be flexible, flexible, flexible.
So it's useful just to have a think for a moment about where you might see some of those overlaps between asset-based community development and the trauma-informed community building principles. So do take a look at those on the screen and perhaps make some comments, or we'll open up the conversation in a moment just around those ABCD principles of starting with gifts, building the relationships for mutual support, valuing the small, and believing in possibility and that strength-based approach. And of course, leading by stepping back, which I think is really difficult within the trauma-informed space, particularly for helping professionals who may have that tendency to want to step in, but it's discerning when do you step in to address perhaps social inequalities and when do you step back in order to grow the power of the community itself. And I think there's a difficult space for a lot of paid professionals to be working in. So if you can just take a look at those for a moment, and then we'll just move on to the final stretch of this before we open it up for any questions. I wanted to share with you a little bit of academic research. I'm not sure how many academics are here in the chat today, but this is a great piece of research by Dr. Richard Audsley, who primarily was doing research on collective trauma in North America. So he used some of the work that, or some of the examples, such as the Hurricane Katrina incident and some of the school shootings. But some of his work started to identify this lenses model, L being for recovery leadership, E for community engagement, N for narrative and storytelling, which Michelle has brought a lot into this conversation today. S for social capital building, or connecting, as we might call it. And then collective action or collective efficacy is the E. So you're kind of getting a feel here for the sorts of things that he was starting to identify, and of course that S being for the social support outcomes. So if you're interested in the academic side of things, I would encourage you to go and have a look at that report. We'll leave you on this message here. Those social ties are the cheapest medicine we have. So we really do need to be investing in the relationships. As Michelle said earlier, it's build relationships before you need them. My details and Michelle's email are here on the screen, so do feel free to jot those down. Send us any questions, but as I say, we're not the experts in this space. We're just people, I guess, that are curious and nosy and keep having more conversations about it. But on that note, Helen, I think I haven't been monitoring the conversations in the chat, so I'll leave it over to you, and perhaps you can raise any questions that you think might be relevant to this audience.
I think we can open it up. We have had a lot of comments in the chat and questions about resources that people have been slipping in some links, and I think those are being captured. But I have some questions, but I'd love to just open it up in general if people have questions they'd like to ask in follow up.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Whilst people are thinking of their deadly questions that they're going to be asking us, and by the way, deadly means awesome in Aboriginal Australian language, I just want to thank Janine, who's joined us from South Africa, for sharing co-powerment. That might be my new word. I love it. So thank you very much, Janine. And I don't have to use empowerment.
I have a question, which is comes from my teaching undergraduates about using the ABCD framework in their different sites where they work, in nonprofit sites around Chicago, but in their lives, and their concept of leading by stepping back, which they really resonate to, but for helping professionals and undergrads and me, how do you teach discernment? Or what are some tips for um, learning to discern when to be what Terry Bergdahl called a catalytic outsider, unhelpful outsider, or I think it's easy when you live in a neighborhood or when you are part of a community that you might be working with, but it's a little bit more difficult when you might be in a college class or in a helping profession in an office where you're working or a government position. So I'd love your wisdom on how to learn discernment. But I know deep listening is one thing, but
Mm. That's what I was going to say, Helen. I think it's shut up and listen
yeah.
is the first thing, and then you know that gives you time and hearing multiple stories to actually know what role you play. If you jump into a community all guns blazing, um, chances are you're going to do harm.
Mhm. Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Rich?
I think there's something in here about self-awareness and reflection, um, and really think about who we are as individuals. I'm mindful as a white male. There may be a tendency for me to step in to something, and it's learning, when am I not needed here, or when do I need to step back, and how do we address that privilege that may be inherent within our society. And I'm not sure we necessarily create sufficient number of opportunities for self-reflection and doing the inner work. And I think I wonder how much of ABCD and trauma-informed work is about our inner practice as well as our what we do within our communities. I can see a few people nodding to that, so I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on any reflections or their experience of being in that space.
I did see the comment about song and story, and I think surrounding oneself with culture is really important. And I'm a big mindfulness believer, and use mindfulness in my own work in ABCD, tie those together. Other folks on.
Helen, I just want to pick up, and I'm going to actually invite Mary because what you've written in the chat there really intrigues me. And so I want you to, if you're happy to, unmute yourself and share, because I think what you've written there really sort of strikes a chord with me, particularly around colonization and taking away those elements of story and dance and things like that. So please share, Mary.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've divided my life between the city of Chicago and Central America. So I'm here in Honduras today, where I've spent about 30 years, and also the wartime years in Central America. And I think that the importance of original people that that you underlined and that others at the very beginning, to not lose sight of original people, is extremely important. But I'm also shocked at recent attempts to erase very recent histories. So, for example, here in Central America, there were deadly wars that were, mainly funded by the United States during the 1980s, and it is very difficult for people to keep those histories alive. Its textbooks aren't written that talk about the history in the way that it really happened. And I think in the United States, we definitely see that in the very, very obvious and brutal efforts to not include African American history, Native people's history, Latina history in the United States. One of the victories, just to end on a happy note, though, is that it's happy, it's sad too, but one of the things that here in Honduras is that after many, many, many years, this is like 40 years now, the Committee of the Family Members of the Disappeared, which is a grassroots organization that organized the victims. They were the victims. They organized themselves to demand that people, that there be, a return, or at least accountability for the loss of the lives of their loved ones. After all this time, they were able to purchase a small piece of rural land in which there were 2 houses, and those houses were torture centers. And those houses were restored. The victims, 6 or 8 victims who are still alive, went back. They circled places. They've made an historic museum, bring groups together, bring schools together, so that we can all see and live what happened there. So I see tying, to not get on too long, but I see that was very hopeful, even though victims were present in the dedication of this, to finally have that story told in a visual and visceral way meant so much to people. And I very much see it as related to trauma, that, that the trauma that happened, although we don't want to re-victimize people, to find opportunities that the history is not lost. So thank you for inviting me to speak about that.
Thanks, Mary. For me, that's what you've shared is that really that importance of truth telling, as part of healing. And unfortunately, as we see the rise of the right globally, we're seeing truth telling being ignored. And, here at the moment, our Conservative opposition is talking about, if they get elected, their refusal to acknowledge the Aboriginal flag even. So it's, the world is trying to other everybody, so where are those safe spaces for everybody? If the right takes control globally, I fear for where we're headed, and it's even more important for community to stand up and have their voices heard.
And as you were talking, Mary, earlier on, it triggered some thinking for me around AI and how some of the social media platforms as well and the algorithms are removing history. And I think that's a really challenging place to be in, and it's where we need our communities to be able to really invest in that storytelling approach, so those stories do stay local and within the footprint of our physical communities that we live and work in. So I don't know, are there any more questions or any more topics or reflections that you would like to air or share with each other?
Some thoughts here, so many directions, and thank you all. There's wonderful things here and lots of things firing. But the one in particular that I wanted to share, I dropped a few links in the chat, but I'm in a point in life where the hard work of going from you have the ideas to you actually have to do the work. And there's a lot I'm learning by like it made sense on paper, and exploring it in relationship and context is really hard. But I did drop a few years ago, I learned about the work of Sean Ginwright, who his piece, and I can't find the original person, was actually like a nurse practitioner working in the health equity space, and I can't find her work. But he has a piece called The Future of Healing, Shifting from Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement, that's been picked up in a few spaces. And so it's sort of the asset-based community development shift around trauma-informed, and drop some things in there, which I think, could be a good piece to sort of support and analyze this work. And I had some other thoughts, which I've forgotten. There's so many layers, but just thanks to all that are working on this.
Thank you so much. And we'll have a look for those threads in the chat later on. There's been lots of comments in there, so it's difficult to keep up with them all, but thank you for
But
sharing.
you can analyze after the fact. And he has a bigger book that I think most folks in the asset-based community development space would like, and I'll throw that link in as well. But that healing-centered piece in particular was helpful for me when I first ran into it.
That's great. Thank you. Any more reflections or observations?
Amazing. What a great discussion and opportunity to hear from so many. And thank you to Richard and Michelle for leading us in today's session. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.